right, let's get right into it. So what we're going to be building today is we're going to be building Tic Tac Toe, obviously. I'm going to be doing this probably a little bit different than others might have done it in previous tutorials. However, I wanted to kind of do it unique because if you go and you see one tutorial and you complete the tutorial and it works great and everything, but maybe the method that they use doesn't quite click in your brain, sometimes you want to go to a different tutorial and see how they did it. So what I do with my tutorials is I don't look at how other people write the code that they write. So Tic Tac Toe has obviously been done a lot, but I have not gone and seen how other people do it. This is purely original just for that reason. So let's go ahead and demonstrate what it is we're going to be doing today. So over here we have Tic Tac Toe, and we can take our turn, and then the opponent automatically takes their turn. And when you win, as you can see, they turn red just to show you the sequence that won the game. And of course, the AI, as we'll call it in this game, is going to be extremely simple. If you guys want me to in the future come back to this video and improve upon this AI, let me know in the comments and I will go ahead and put that on the list of things to do, okay? So let's go ahead and start with the HTML. Go ahead and create a folder called Tic Tac Toe, and in that folder I want you to create 3 files: index.html, script.js, and style.css, all in the same folder. Once you have that done, we're going to go ahead and start writing our HTML for the app. So let's start by creating our basic tags, our head tags and our body tags. And then inside of the head tag, we're going to want to put a link to our CSS, rel equals style sheet, and href is going to be equal to style.css. And then in the body tag, at the bottom here, we'll go ahead and add our JavaScript file. So put a script tag and src, which stands for source. Go ahead and put script.js. So now we have our JavaScript and our CSS files linked. Let's go ahead and start putting in our container. So just so we can be on the same page, I'm going to go ahead and open this. It's going to be a blank screen for now. But I've got the console down here, and the display is going to be up here. So this div here, this is going to be our container for basically everything. So I'm going to give it an ID of container. And then inside of here, I'm going to start by putting an h1 tag that's just going to say Tic Tac Toe. And so if I save this and refresh it, now we see Tic Tac Toe on the screen. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create 9 divs, and each of these divs is going to represent a quadrant inside of the Tic Tac Toe. So if I refresh this, each one of these divs is going to represent one of these squares in order. So it's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and you're going to see why in a minute that we're starting at 0 instead of 1. So let's give each of these a class of Q, which is going to stand for quadrant, and an ID. Each of these is going to be Q, and then the corresponding quadrant number. So in this case, we're going to start with 0. Let's create 9 of these. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then on the way down, you just want to go ahead and number these in order all the way until 8. Okay, so now we have quadrants 0 through 8. If you're not caught up, go ahead, pause the video, and go at your own pace, and then resume the video. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and let's go ahead and see. Okay, so when I refresh the page, as you can see, there's nothing on the display. And that's because these are just plain divs. There's nothing there to display yet. We haven't given it a height, we haven't given it borders. So let's go ahead and move on to the CSS part of this tutorial. So here we'll go ahead and start with the container. The container is going to have a width of 320 pixels. Not PC, pixels, there we go. And a height of 320 pixels as well. The margin is going to be auto, and the margin top is going to be 100 pixels. Now the margin top is just so that it gives us a little breathing room between the top of the window and the tic-tac-toe board itself. It's just a little bit better in terms of aesthetic. The margin auto, what that's going to do is it's going to center the div into the middle of the screen horizontally. The width is going to be 320 pixels because each of these quadrants here is going to be 100 pixels wide. And the 20 is coming from the fact that each of these borders are 10 pixels each. So we're giving it 320 pixels so that it'll fit perfectly. The height is 320 because we want this to be a perfect square. So if we save and refresh, on this side, we still don't have the board available yet because we have not given it borders. So let's start. Let's actually go ahead and do the header really quick. So text align is going to be center so that it's centered horizontally with the board. The font size, we're going to go ahead and increase that up to 40 pixels. And the margin bottom is going to be 50 pixels. So the text should now align and be bigger. Great. So let's go ahead and start designing our quadrant squares. So each one of these, like I said earlier, is going to be 100 pixels wide and 100 pixels tall. We're going to float them left so that they go in a row. And then we are going to give a margin of 0 and a padding of 0 because we don't want any padding or margin within our quadrants. The cursor is going to be pointer. And the reason why we're doing that is because whenever you hover over one of these, for instance, on the finished version, as you can see, we hover over and it becomes a hand. See, it's an arrow now, and then when we hover over it, it becomes a hand. It just sort of lets the user know, hey, you can click this. So let's go ahead and go to text align, and that's going to be center as well. The font family is going to be sans serif. Now, why am I doing sans serif? Let's go ahead and demonstrate the difference between sans serif and serif fonts. So as you can see here, let me go ahead and make this bigger. Okay, let me just do it here. A serif are these little lines. So as you can see, the font, the actual F has these little lines on them. Those are called serifs. Sans serif basically means without serif. So it doesn't have those little extra lines. Now when we do Tic Tac Toe in person, like normally when we do X's and O's, they don't have serifs. So we don't want that. So we're going to say sans serif so that they don't have those lines. So go ahead and put font family sans serif, and let's increase the font size up to 100 pixels so it's nice and big. So still we don't have anything yet because we're going to have to add the borders. However, the interesting thing about this is that the borders are going to have to be different for every quadrant, because if we go over here, for instance, this right here has a border bottom and a border left, but this one doesn't have a border left. So we're going to have to kind of go in and style some of these individually. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy mine over since I've already written it and let you copy this over. And what we're saying here is all of these guys, quadrant 0, quadrant 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, are all going to have a border bottom of 10 pixels solid black. Go ahead and copy that over. And when I save that and refresh this page, now you can see that the quadrants are separated vertically. However, we need to go ahead and separate them horizontally as well. So I want you to copy this as well. Now this is going to be for, I'll point this out, quadrants, these quadrants right here, and these quadrants right here. And that's going to be left border 10 pixels solid black. So let's go ahead and refresh that. And now you can see we actually have the quadrants. But one thing that we want to go ahead and add, I would put this directly under this section, is .q hover. And if you put this :hover after our class name, what that's saying is this, whatever's inside of here between these brackets is going to apply to this class whenever you hover over it. And we want to give it that kind of azure, hope I pronounced that right, background color. So when I refresh, now you can see it kind of lights up just a little bit, so you can kind of see that you're hovering over the square that you are wanting to hover over. So the very final thing that we want to add here is the winner class. And all we're going to do is we're going to say color red. Because if you remember over here, whenever someone wins, the winning line, the winning sequence becomes red. So we're going to go ahead and add this class via JavaScript. We are officially done with the CSS and HTML, but I'm going to go ahead and leave them open because I might come back to them in the future during this tutorial. So now that we're done with the HTML and CSS, let's go ahead and move on over to the JavaScript. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to kind of work backwards, because this is going to be more of a functional programming paradigm. It's not going to be entirely functional. There's going to be a lot of functional programmers that are out there. They're going to be like, that's not pure functional programming. Trust me, I know. It's just going to be a little bit more functional than what probably some people are used to, especially if you come from an object-oriented programming background. So with this JavaScript here, we're going to be using a ton of functions that just do one thing, and then we're going to be using those functions as tools and kind of within the program flow. And I'll just show you what I mean throughout the app. You'll understand exactly what I mean. It's not going to be confusing, so don't be worried. Let's go ahead and start. So I'm going to create a const variable here, and it's going to be a two-dimensional array, which means that it's an array of other arrays. And each of these arrays is going to represent a winning sequence. So what do I mean by that? Well, 0, 1, and 2, quadrants 0, 1, and 2, 0, 1, and 2. If all three of these are the same letter, like X or O, then we know we have a winner. The same applies to 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then we have 0, 4, and 8, which is a diagonal win. And then we have 2, 4, and 6, which is another diagonal win. And then we also have the columns. So each of these represents, basically this is every single possible combination of ways you can win in tic-tac-toe. We're going to be using this to detect whether or not someone has won a little bit later on. So let's go ahead and start by setting up our click listeners. So one of the things we're going to be doing is whenever it's our turn, we're going to want to be able to listen for clicks on the screen. And whenever it's not our turn, we're going to want to remove those click listeners. That way, if the user, I'll show you here, if I start clicking all over the place, well, it's not my turn. I shouldn't be able to click yet. So it waits. So we're going to remove those event listeners whenever we don't want to use them. So let's go ahead and start by doing that. Let's create a function called enable listeners. And these are arrow functions. I'll leave a link in the description below if you're not familiar with ES6 specific syntax. I've got a video where in the first 10 minutes of the video I go over some of these things. So please click that if you're a little bit confused as to this arrow function syntax, okay? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna set these event listeners on every single one of the Q classes because the Q represents quadrant. As you see here, each one of these quadrants has the Q class. So we're going to grab all of these from the HTML, loop through them, and add an event listener to every single one of these. However, it's easier in JavaScript if we treat whatever we get, like we use document.getElements by class name to get all of the elements of a specific class, but it returns a query list by default. What we want is we want an array. So I'm going to create a function called grid that's simply going to return an array of that query list. And we're going to do that by saying array.from, and then inside of here, we'll go ahead and put document.getElements by class name, not tag name. Get elements by class name. And the class that we want is called Q. So whenever we call grid like this, that's actually going to represent that array of that query list of all of those elements. And we're going to, since we have that array, we can use the array functions that JavaScript provides to us, such as for each. And for each one of these Q elements, these quadrant elements, we want to add event listener. Of what type? Well, we want to listen for clicks. Now the question is, what do we want to happen every time we detect one of these clicks? Well, we're going to want to have a click function. And I'm going to go ahead and create the click function, but I'm only going to put a log statement inside of it for now. So one more thing I need to explain is whenever we have an event listener, we first pass the type of event listener, which is click, and then whatever function we pass as the second parameter here, it automatically passes the JavaScript click event or whatever type of event it is. In our case here, it's a click. So it's going to automatically pass that click event. So we can expect that to be passed as the parameter here. I put a $sign here to represent events. You do not have to put a $sign there. It does not matter. So we're going to take that event, and for now, we are just going to log it. Okay, so now we have enable listeners. So whenever we call this, we're going to add click listeners, and we're going to be able to listen for clicks, and whatever happens inside of this click function is going to happen. But we, as explained earlier, are also going to want the ability to disable listeners. And we're going to do the exact same thing here. We're going to take the grid and we're going to loop through it. And for each Q element, instead of adding the event listener, we're going to use remove event listener. we want to remove click events, and we want to remove the click function from that listener. So now we have the ability to both enable and disable the listeners for all of these quadrants. So let's go ahead and test that. I've got the console open here, and I'm going to refresh, and I'm going to click here. Okay, we're not getting anything yet because I'm not calling enable listeners yet. So beneath all of this, let's go ahead and call that function so we can initiate everything. And now you can see we have that JavaScript event each and every time. However, we don't really want the event. We want the element that we're clicking on. So after event here, I'm just going to put .target and refresh. And now you can see it's the element that is being logged. So if I click, say, Q8, when I click that, you'll see ID of Q8. So you know that you're clicking the right one. So what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and go through and go through all of the helper functions that we're going to be using in this app. So we already have grid. I consider that a helper function because it doesn't really rely on any other functions, and it really is helpful, and we use it throughout the app. So let's go ahead and create one that we're going to be using called QNumID. And what this is going to do is it's going to so one thing that's interesting is these IDs are strings, and we really want them to be numbers because we're going to be using these as to access elements within that array. And that's why we used 0 through 8 instead of 1 through 9, because when you access the very first element of an array, it's 0. It always starts at 0. So this is going to make it really helpful for us. But it's a string, and it also has this Q in it. So if we want to access something in an array like grid and then 0, it has to be a number, not Q0. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a function that does exactly what we want to do. It's going to turn it, it's going to get that Q out of the ID name, and it's going to convert that number from a string to an actual number. So I hope that makes sense. Let's go ahead and write it. So we're going to use number.parseInt, and we are going to pass to this the Q element, which is going to be an argument here. So go ahead and add that as the argument. Q element .id, but we want to use .replace, and we want to replace that Q with an empty string, which is effectively getting rid of the Q. So this right here, this section is, say we click on Q0, now it's 0, but it's a string. However, now that's being passed to number.parseInt, so whatever this returns is just going to be the number that represents that element. So now we want to move on to the next helper function. We're going to have a helper function called empty Qs. Empty quadrants is what that stands for. So what we want is we want to be able to return an array of all of the quadrants here that don't have an X or a 0 in it. And that's going to be helpful for us later when we're detecting which quadrants the opponent or the AI is going to be able to select. So let's say grid. And since we know that's an array, we can use the array function filter, which is built into JavaScript. And for each Q element, if it passes the test that we're about to provide, then it's going to be added to the array that's returned by empty Qs. So we're going to say we want every single Q element where the Q element, the inner text within it, is equal to an empty string. So it's going to go through that grid. It's going to find every single one of the Q elements where the inner text is equal to an empty string, and it's going to build an array from that, and it's going to return that. And we're going to use that in the app. We're going to have one more good helper function called allSame, which is going to take an array. And what we want it to do is we want it to tell us whether or not all of the items within the array are the same. So what we want to do, it's going to be a little bit more unique than that, because we don't really want to say they're all the same if they're empty strings, because we don't want the empty strings to count. So I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. So we're going to say r.every, and every is another function that's built into JavaScript for arrays. And for each Q element, we want to say QL dot inner text is equal to R0, and I'll explain this in a second. Inner text, and also Q element dot inner text does not equal an empty string, okay? Because remember I said we don't really want to count the empty strings because the way that we're going to be using this is to detect whether or not we have a winner. And we only have a winner if all three are the same, if it's a 0 or an X. By default, if we grab all three of these are going to be the same, but they're empty strings. They're not really winners though, right? Because there's not X's or O's in them. So we want to have this all same function that does this. Now what's going on here? So we want to say whichever queue element we are on, because we're looping through it using every, whichever queue element we are on, the inner text in that needs to be equal to whatever the inner text is for the first element of that array. And what we're basically saying is whatever this is needs to match and be equal to whatever the first item is in that array. So if this is an X, say we're using these first three here to check, and this is an array of 3 quadrants. If this is an X, then this has to be an X, and this also has to be an X. You get what I'm saying? So all same is basically going to determine whether or not all 3 of these are X's or all 3 of these are O's. That's going to be it for our helper functions. Let's go ahead and move on to our take turn function. Take turn is going to accept an index and a letter. The index is going to be essentially which quadrant we're going to be taking our turn on, and the letter is going to be either X or O. Well, let's go ahead and grab the grid and access it by the index that we pass it. Then we're going to say the inner text for whichever quadrant element we access is going to be equal to whichever letter we pass this function. So if we pass this 0 and O, then it's going to go in and it's going to find 0, quadrant 0, and it's going to put an O there. Now, it's not quite going to work yet because we haven't utilized this function yet, but we're going to get there because we're going to put that inside of click function. So let's go ahead and start building our click function right now. So remember, this is the function that gets called whenever we click on it, but it's also going to be the function that gets called whenever the opponent takes their turn as well. So let's go ahead and start building this click function. We're going to build it 90% of the way now, and we're going to come back at the end and finish this click function. All right, so the first thing that we're going to want to do when we detect a click is call take turn. We're going to want to pass it the ID, because remember, the ID of each of these represents the index of that quadrant. So this being Q1, that represents the index 1 in the array of these quadrants. So we want to go ahead and pass Q num ID, because remember we have that helper function here that we created earlier to parse out the number from our ID. And we want to pass that event.target. Now, whenever it's our turn, we're going to be X. The opponent will be O. Now, as you can see here, what I said by we're going to be coding very functionally in this. As you can see here, we're passing functions to other functions, and even though this function evaluates to a number, it still visually looks like we're passing a function to another function. So in order, what's happening here is we're saying pass QNumID, this event.target, this element. It's going to return, say, 1 or 3 or whatever, and it's going to pass that to take turn as the index. Hopefully that's making sense. And then the second thing we're going to want to do is call opponent turn. Now, we don't have that function yet, so let's go ahead and write it. So the interesting thing about the opponent turn is it's going to have to pick an item on its own. So the very first thing though that we want to do is we want to disable all of the listeners. So let's go ahead and use that function we called earlier. Because when it's the opponent's turn, we can't be clicking and taking our turn. You know, it's not our turn yet. So go ahead and disable the listeners. Now we're going to use set timeout. And the reason why we want to use set timeout, what this does is it says we can wait some time. In our case, we're going to wait 1 second before running the code inside of it. And the reason why we want to do that is because we want it to feel more natural, like we're actually playing against an opponent. And if we didn't have this, if I were to click here, the opponent would instantly take their turn. And we don't want that. We want it to wait 1 second and then take its turn. So we're going to pass a function as the first parameter. And the second parameter is going to be in milliseconds, the amount of time you want to wait. So 1000 milliseconds is going to be equal to 1 second. And in here, we want to go ahead and say take turn. And what we're going to end up doing is we're going to end up having a function called opponent choice, which I'm going to go ahead and put down here. Opponent choice. And for now, it's just going to return the number 0. But what we're actually going to do is have it return a random quadrant that's empty. And we'll get to that a little bit later. But let's go ahead and say opponent choice. That's the index, which for now is going to be 0, but also the letter. And the letter for opponents is O. So then after all of this, we want to go ahead and re-enable listeners so that it's your turn again. So if I refresh this, let's see what happens when I click this. So we get the X, and then the opponent goes on the 0 quadrant because we're just returning 0 here. So we don't really want that. We want it to actually pick a real quadrant. So because no matter what I pick, it's just going to keep putting the 0 here since we're returning 0. Let's go ahead and make it return a random one. So this is going to be kind of interesting to explain. Anybody who's coded in other languages knows oftentimes there's a very simple way to generate a random number between 0 and some other number. In JavaScript, it's not quite as intuitive. So let's go through this. What we're going to do is we're going to say whatever we choose needs to be an actual index number. So let's call qnumId because we're going to pass a random quadrant element to this qnumId function, which is inevitably going to parse out the index number and pass it to this take turn function that we have inside of opponent turn. Okay, so what we're going to want to do inside of this qnumId is we're going to want to say empty queues. That's that function that we created earlier that returns all of the available empty quadrant elements. And inside of here, I'm sorry, not inside of that function, still inside of qnumId, what we want to do is we want to access a random element inside of that array. In reality, it's not an array, it's a query list, but we can still access it like items in an array. We just can't use array methods on it. Oh, I apologize. It is going to be an array. See, this is why functional programming is a little weird to get used to, because sometimes you have to backtrack 5 steps, but it ends up becoming useful in the long run, especially when you're trying to manage state, which I'll go over in a future tutorial. Anyway, so the empty queues is an array, and we want to access some random element inside of that array. So how do we do that? So we're going to do math.floor. Whatever's passed to math.floor, if it's like 8.7, it's going to round it down to the whole number, so 8. Even though 8.9999999 is really close to 9, it's still going to round it down to 8 because we're using math.floor. So whatever we have inside of this, whatever we evaluate, is going to get rounded down to the nearest whole number, which is what we want to pass to qnumId. Empty queues in the first place in order to access the element that we want. Hope this is making sense. I know it's a little bit confusing. So we're going to say math.random. Now math.random actually returns a float, which is, we'll just, for sake of ease, say a decimal number between 0 and 1. It includes 0. So 0 is a possible number that it can return, but 1 is not. It returns it up to 1, so non-inclusive of 1. So the highest number could be like 0.9999999 or whatever. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to multiply that number by the length of empty queues. So now we have, say, 0.9999999 times the length of empty queues, that array. Then remember, whatever gets evaluated from that then gets rounded down to the nearest whole number. Remember that. So this is beneficial because the length of the array is always one more than the number corresponding to the final index of that array. So what I mean by that is the length of the array is 9, but the last index is 8 because it starts at 0. And if you take 0.9999999, for example, and you say that's returned by math.random, if we multiply that number by 9, which is the length of that array, you're going to end up with like 8.999999, which inevitably gets rounded down to 8, meaning that the highest number that you can get from this is the final index of the array. So that's how that works, and that's how we want it to work. So hope that makes sense. Go ahead and save, and let's see if we get a working AI. So far, so good. Okay, now we're going to get an error because it doesn't know whether or not we're allowed to take another turn, if that makes sense. So we don't really know whether or not the opponent is allowed to take another turn or if we're not allowed to take another turn. So what we really need to do is check for victory. And we're going to need a couple of functions here that are really quite simple. Const end game, which is going to be what happens when we end the game, obviously. And we're going to need check for victory. Okay. Let me put that const in there. So what we're going to do is before we switch to the other person's turn, whoever that person might be. So in my case, if I click, the click function here states at the end, it's the opponent turn. So effectively, opponent turn, when I call it here, is me switching turns to the opponent. Before that, we want to say if not check for victory. Check for victory is going to return false if there's no victor yet. It's going to return true if someone has one. So if there's still no winner, then we're going to go ahead and pass it off to the opponent. But we need to do the same thing with the opponent turn and it becoming our turn. So let's go ahead and actually copy that line and put that here as well. And for now, just for the sake of ease, I think what I want to do, I think I want to log an endgame here. Let's just say game over by default. So whenever the game is over, all that we're going to see for now is a log statement in here that says game over. So we need to go ahead and put the logic in for check for victory. And this is probably the most complicated part of it, maybe. That opponent choice was kind of hard to explain, but hopefully this makes sense, and it should, because it is quite simple. So we're going to say let victory equal false at the top here. So by default, victory is going to be false. And if we do find a victory, then we're going to go ahead and switch that up to true, and we're going to return it at the end. So let's go ahead and say return victory and put the logic in between these two statements here. So what we're going to do is we're going to have winning combos. Remember, that's this at the top. We're going to loop through that. And for each combo, we're going to do some stuff. And let's go ahead and start by grabbing our grid. I'm putting an underscore here just because it's local, and I don't want it to conflict with this const variable name up here. And I also do this here because it's local to a loop. It's just a habit that I do. You don't have to put the underscore if you don't want to. So set that equal to grid. Now, why don't I just use this? Well, in this case, we're going to be using grid multiple times, so I don't want to just go and call this function that does a bunch of stuff 5 times when I don't need to. So I'm going to go ahead and set it equal to a const here, and then let's go ahead and do const sequence. And basically what we're going to do here is we know that this is a winning sequence. So what we want to do is we want to go in and we want to grab that sequence from the grid itself and check whether or not they're all same. Okay, that's what we have this all same function here for. We want to go through, loop through winning combos. We want to check if this particular sequence is all the same, and then if that's not all the same, we'll go through and keep checking all of these sequences. And if any of these happen to all be the same on this grid, then we know we have a victory. If none of them are all same on this grid, any of these sequences, then we know we don't have a victory. So let's start by creating the sequence that we want. So the sequence is going to be an array of 3 elements because obviously each of these have 3 elements in it. And whenever you have a winner, it's always 3 in a row. So this is going to be 3 elements, 0, 1, and 2. 0, 1, and 2, 0, 1, and 2, that's the index to access each of these items. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the first element here, and we're going to use that grid that we have here, which is equal to the grid, and we're going to access, let's just hypothetically say we are on 6, 7, and 8. We're looping through this, and now we're on 6, 7, and 8. We want to access the 0th item of this, which is 6. Which it's not actually that one because it's, sorry, this, like I said, it's a little bit confusing. Let me write it out first so that I can concentrate on explaining. Mess this up. There we go. So I'm going to copy this 3 times really quick. Okay. So we're looping through the winning combos. So C is going to represent which combination we're on. So if we're on the 3rd iteration, let's just say it's 6, 7, and 8, okay? So C represents the array 6, 7, and 8. We want to access 0, 1, and 2 of that because we know there's 3 items. 0, 1, and 2 corresponds to 6, 7, and 8. And we want to access, we're going to pretend that that is an index because it is. So 6 is an index within this array. And we want to check, and we want to grab the 6th element, the 7th element, and the 8th element of this array. So what we're doing is we're saying 6, so underscore C0 is 6, underscore C1 is 7, underscore C2 is 8. And what we're doing is we're accessing the 6th element of the grid, the 7th element of the grid, and the 8th element of the grid. Hope I explained that correctly. I mean, I know I explained it correctly, but hopefully it was good enough because it's a little confusing, but you'll get it as you're writing it out. So we want to say if all same sequence. So if this sequence of 3 items on this grid are all the same, then, like I said earlier, we know we have a victory. So we're gonna go ahead and say victory is equal to true, and we're gonna go ahead and end the game. So in here we'll pass sequence to endgame. That way within endgame we can add the winning classes to it. But for now we'll say game over, and then winning sequence, which I need to add as a parameter to this function. Okay. So let's see if this function works. Let's refresh. Let's try to get a winner really quick. He got in my way. Okay, so now we have a winner. So as you can see here, we have 3 in a row here, which we know is a winner. And here we see game over and the winning row, which is 0, 1, and 2. Quadrants 0, 1, and 2 are the winning quadrants. So that worked exactly as we were hoping it would. So let's go ahead and come into the endgame function and finish this function off. Let's remove this console.log statement, and instead of doing console.log, let's say winning sequence dot for each. We want to loop through the winning sequence, which, remember, winning sequence is still the actual array of elements themselves on this grid. So we can actually come in here and say q element goes to q element dot class list dot add, and we can actually add winner to that element. And then the very final thing that we're going to want to do is disable listeners, because we don't want to be able to still try to take a turn when someone won the game, right? So let's refresh. Let's see if this works. All right, we have a winner. All right, so that was the tutorial. Like I said earlier, if you would like me to go back and create a more complicated AI for this so that it's a bit more of a challenge, so that, say I come here, it just, hey, it did it that time, let's try it again. So it should know that this was a better option than this, because now I can just win. We can create a more complicated AI. Just let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I will just move on to bigger and better things. But I'm going to leave the links in the description for everything that you'll need for this tutorial, including the source code and the previous video. If you liked this video, if it helped you, please subscribe to my channel. It helps me out a lot. I've also got a Patreon, which I'll include in the link below. If you want to help me, you don't have to. And a couple of affiliate links for Amazon in case you want to use any of the equipment that I use in my videos. Thank you guys very much.